like a director or a bit program. Yeah.
Alright, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Alpo. I'm a graduate student working in Canada in the field learning program. And it's my honor today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rajesh Rao. He's someone whose work has been influential in the field of computational neuroscience. He also has been a major inspiration to my own research, my work with Canada. Dr. Rao is a professor at the University of Washington in the Computer Science and Engineering Department. He's also the co-director of the Neurotechnology Center there. It's a center that works at the intersection of neuroscience, engineering, and also AI. Before that, Dr. Rao was a fellow Yellow Jacket, so not on the Georgia Tech side. He's in the University of Rochester. He earned his master's and PhD from there, where he worked with Dana Ballard. And then he joined the Salk Institute as a postdoctoral fellow before he joined the University of Washington as an assistant professor. Over the years, his research has earned him so many awards and a lot of accomplishments, including the NSF Career Award, the ONR Young Investigator Award, a Sloan Fellowship, also an election as the fellow of IEEE. His research spans theoretical, applied neuroscience, and also there's a lot of engineering work there, working at the brain-computer interfaces. So I think most of us know about his predictive coding work, which has brought a lot of research in this area, trying to learn how the brain learns generative models of the world. But he also works on brain-computer interfaces, so a little bit more on the engineering side, and he's also been kind of engaged in some of the first experiments on human-to-human brain communication. So a lot of work there. I don't think I can fit everything into an introduction here, but he's going to talk to us about his most recent work on active predictive coding today. We're incredibly lucky to have him talk to us about this today. So thank you everyone for being here, and join me in welcoming Dr. Rajesh Rao.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Abdul. Appreciate that. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. So I should probably begin by apologizing to all of you here in Atlanta for bringing the rain with me in Seattle. So I'm hoping to take it away tomorrow, and hopefully you won't have any more rain. So we'll see. So what I'll talk about today is this new ideas that some of the ideas that we're working on in this area called predictive coding, and more specifically active predictive coding. But before I do that, I thought I would give you an introduction to some of the things that we do in my lab. And these are the broad areas that we cover. So there's the computational neuroscience aspects. I put a couple of books that I was involved in co-editing. And then there's also work in brain-computer interfaces, as Abdul mentioned. And there's a textbook I wrote some time ago when people were asking me, how do I get involved in the field of BCI? And we realized at that time, and this was in the early 2000s, there was no textbook at that time. And so we started to think about, okay, maybe we could have an introductory textbook. And it does needs probably some updating by now, obviously, right, in this very rapidly changing field. But we're hoping to do that at some point, to have a second edition. And then finally, there's also the area of neurally inspired or brain-inspired AI, which if you think about what AI is today, like, when I was a graduate student, neural networks were not really considered a legitimate AI area. It was all about symbolic, good old-fashioned AI. But now pretty much everybody thinks of AI as being founded on artificial neural networks, right? Transformer models or deep learning and things like that. So it's really interesting to see how things have come. But I think that's an area that has still got a lot to contribute in terms of getting inspiration from the brain and building new artificial intelligence architectures. What I thought I'll do today is I'm going to focus on the computational neuroscience aspects for the majority of the talk, but I thought it would be good to give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the things that we've done in the BCI areas as well, given that there's a lot of really amazing stuff being done here at Georgia Tech in this area as well, in neural engineering, neurotechnology, and BCI. So one of the things that we're working on is something we're calling brain coprocessors. And this is basically building on the idea of a brain-computer interface, but trying to see, can we infuse AI in the form of artificial neural networks to this particular interaction between the brain and a computer, right? And this would also involve both recording and stimulating the brain. So this is basically a closed loop control system, which is, again, something that people here, like Chris and Garrett, have been working on. We were quite inspired by some of that work as well. And the basic idea being that, okay, you want to be able to record from the brain in order to decode, right? This is the decoding problem of what exactly is the brain doing in terms of the brain state estimation, and then also being able to modulate or control certain parts of the brain in order to achieve a particular outcome that you want to achieve, right? And so the most general case would be something like this, where you have external information coming in. This would be, for example, feedback from external sensors and so on, as well as recordings from the brain. And these both would be used as inputs to an AI system or an artificial neural network. And then, of course, the output of that could be either directly going to a computer. This would be the traditional, brain control cursor or a robotic prosthetic arm, things like that. That would be the external actuator. But you could also have the output of the network going back to the brain, and this would be in the form of stimulation or modulation of the brain activity, right? And the biggest challenge here is, of course, how do you set this up, right? And so we had some suggestions, and I think if you look back in terms of what people in the field have suggested, there's the whole idea of model-based control versus model-free control that connects to things like reinforcement learning and so on. What we suggested was a way to use artificial neural networks and then do something like backpropagation, right, through these networks. But then, of course, the big problem we faced there was how do you backpropagate through part of the brain, right? Because the brain is involved in this closed loop, right? So if you're really trying to minimize some error that has to do with the task that the human is doing. So take, for example, stroke, right? So if you want to be able to allow a person to reach again when the person has stroke, then how do you actually make a neural network that can take over some of that function where it's minimizing the error in grasping, for example? So you have an external error, which you could use for backpropagation or your favorite error minimization, AI technique, but then that has to be somehow used to change the connections in the neural network, right? The artificial neural network. And so we suggested one way, which was again based on a model. You learn a model of what the effects of the stimulation is, right? You can build that model and then backpropagate through that model and eventually change the connections between the actual neural network, that is trying to modulate the brain activity. So if you're interested, you can look at a couple of papers that we published. There's still some ongoing work in this area. But I think it's a very interesting and open area that I would welcome all of you to think about in terms of, okay, how do we actually have this interaction that between an artificial intelligence system like a neural network and a biological neural network, and how do you make sure they are harmonized with each other? How are they able to achieve some clinical goal, right? That may help somebody with a particular kind of disorder. It could be a psychiatric disorder. It could be a sensory motor disorder, right? So that's an important area, I think. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of work being done at our center. So the motivation for some of this work that we're doing at the Center for Neurotechnology, for which I'm the co-director with Chet Moritz, it builds on some early work that we did in Eb Fetz's lab. So Eb Fetz is a legendary motor neuroscientist who, in this case, showed that if you connect one population of cells in the motor cortex to another population of cells through a sort of one-to-one connection, in the sense of, you have a recording of a spike. For every spike you recorded, you then stimulate, the second populations, shown here by the red circle and the green circle over here. What they showed was that when you have this connection, a causal connection, so you have a spike, you have activity, and then you have a causal connection using this this particular brain-computer interface at the top, and then you stimulate the second area. Then what they showed was that you get a strengthening of the connection, right? So anybody know why you would get this strengthening of connection? What is that learning rule? Hebbian learning, right? So basically they said, okay, why don't we try to artificially induce a causal, activity between area A and area B, or region A, region B, and then have this artificial connection, which is like a very primitive kind of co-processor, if you want to call it that. And then they showed that there is a behavioral effect where if you stimulate that original population, this red, record population, then you do see now that it has recruited the cells' activities in the green area as well, indicating a strengthening of connections between the red population and the green population here within the motor cortex, right? And so this is something that we called engineering plasticity in the brain, right? So you're engineering this neuroplasticity in the brain. And so in the Center for Neurotechnology, which was established as a NSF engineering research center. So how many of you have heard of Engineering Research Center? Many of you, or some of you, okay. All the PIs have, right? It's basically one of the biggest funding mechanisms from NSF for group activity, for collaborative activity across universities as well. And in our case, so we had PIs from Caltech, MIT, San Diego State, and a whole bunch of other places. And the goal was to use this idea of neurostimulation to induce or engineer neuroplasticity. And you could use this for treatment of several conditions like stroke and spinal cord injury, right? And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So the work was started in 2011, right? And NSF funds you for 10 years. That's the maximum. So we got a couple of renewals during those 10 years. And then we graduated from the NSF program, which means they don't fund us anymore, right? But as a consequence of the research done there, we were able to launch a couple of clinical trials. So one of them is this particular trial on a brain-computer interface for closed-loop stimulation for rehabilitation after stroke. And the idea here was, again, it was built on some work done in Eb Fetz's lab with monkeys, showing that if you look at the phase of an oscillation, in this case, the beta oscillation, about 10 to 25 hertz oscillation in the brain, then you can cause potentiation or depression depending on at what phase of that oscillation you deliver the stimulation in. This is electrical stimulation inside the brain. And so the goal here is to focus on upper limb movements. So people who have stroke or are not able to control grasping or other kinds of upper limb movements. And the idea was to see, can we actually use this paradigm to have very targeted rehabilitation of the brain after stroke? And so this was actually an NIH-funded project, which was approved back in 2022. It took a while to get the FDA approval. It's based on a company called Cortex, brain interchange system that allows us to do this closed loop stimulation. And it was approved by the FDA in 2024. And then there's a UW, university approval also that happened just a few months ago in 2024, again in October. And so now it's in the process of recruiting subjects. So we're looking forward to getting some of the data from this and hopefully being able to restore or improve the quality of life of people that may have a stroke in this case. The other clinical trial I'll briefly mention is this one here on non-invasive spinal cord stimulation, again for people in this case who have spinal cord injury. And in this case, it's a very interesting technology, so there's no surgery involved. There is essentially a device that's placed at the back of your neck. And there is this particular paradigm where they've shown, for example, that if you have a very high frequency, in this case 10 kilohertz carrier wave, and then you're modulating that at some frequency like 30 hertz, right? So low frequency delivery, but then there's a high frequency carrier wave that causes you to have no pain, right? So you don't feel the pain. If you directly try to stimulate the skin, you're going to feel a lot of pain, right? And this particular paradigm allows you to then deliver electric currents directly, through the skin, and it goes through to the spinal cord, it activates circuits there. And then the key is to couple this kind of electrical stimulation with physical therapy. So the brain has to generate the intention to move, and that has to come through any residual connections there are. So this won't work if there's a complete spinal cord injury. There has to be some residual fibers that are going through from the brain to the spinal cord, the regions controlling, in this case, again, upper arm movement, or upper limb movement. And if you do this paradigm coupled with physical therapy for several weeks, then they've shown some remarkable improvements. I'll just give you an example, a video here that was, again, done by NSF at the time of our graduation. Let me see if I can play that. There we go. Oh, we may need the audio, right? Okay, maybe you don't need the, I'll be the, so what they show here is the patches that you attach to the back of the head. So you can see a back of the neck. So you can see how there's these two patches that are attached. And then the electrical stimulation device is shown on the left. So it's actually now an FDA-approved device. And this lady was one of our first patients who was not able to initially pick up, in that case, those objects. Here's another person who was not able to pick up these tiny objects. But now, after the stimulation is delivered, during the stimulation, they are able to do that. But the cool thing about this is it's actually inducing plasticity as they're going through this therapy. So it's not just constantly delivering the stimulation, but even 6 months after they have been, they've gone through the stimulation, you have the effects where the patient can start to pick up objects. And in a couple of cases, they were able to actually even perform things that they were not able to perform before, like painting for one of the ladies shown there, and even a musician who was playing a guitar right after they went through this therapy. So it's been quite a amazing I think, sort of results to see that this non-invasive therapy that you could use to enable people with particular kinds of spinal cord injury to then regain a lot of their lost function. It's not a complete recovery, but it's a significant improvement compared to just physical therapy alone. So if you're interested, please do look at Chet Morris's lab's publications for that. All right. So any questions on that before we proceed? Yeah.
How do you do that for this spine? So you're rating the safety.
Yeah. So there is no closed loop. That was a great question. So that's an open loop stimulation, right? So there you're not really reading, any brain signal to deliver the stimulation. That one is an open loop stimulation. So that's basically a starting point where we're saying, okay, what if we couple the intention signals being generated by the brain for movement, have that coming in, but at the same time activate spinal circuits with this open loop electrical stimulation. And then the hope is that those two intersect to actually have, again, it's like a Hebbian kind of mechanism to cause changes in the connectivity between the brain and the spinal cord, right? There have been people who have done closed loop brain spinal, systems, so brain to spinal interface, and so that's another potential way to connect the brain to the spinal cord. Those have been typically invasive procedures, and in that case, that would work for a person with complete spinal cord injury. So there's no way to have signals going from the brain to the spinal cord, then you have to have a bypass. And that would be a bypass, brain spinal interface. And there are groups that are doing that kind of work as well. So that's another example of a brain spinal interface. That would be closed loop in that sense, right? Yeah. All right, any more questions? All right, so I'll move to the main part of the talk, which is the computational neuroscience / neurally inspired AI part of the talk. And feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions as well. So the starting point for a lot of the work in this area that we've done has to do with the neocortex. So we all, love the neocortex because it's got, it's more easily accessible than some other parts of the brain from a neuroscience point of view. And there's also, this notion that perhaps it's what makes us human, right? The neocortex. But the interesting thing from a computational point of view is, yes, there is a diversity of functions. So there is functional specialization, as we have all learned from our neuroscience classes. There's, if you go to the back of the cortex, there is visual coding. If you go to the frontal, it's more motor planning, things like that. On the sides, like if you go, there's an auditory coding and so on. So we've learned there's specialization across the neocortex. But there's also an intriguing, aspect, which is from an anatomical point of view, if you sample different regions of the cortex, right, you'll find a very similar kind of architectural connectivity diagram in the sense that there's these layers of the cortex, typically 6, but they may be different densities. But at the same time, in terms of the laminar connectivity from one layer to the next and so on, and the projections into the cortex, particular layers versus projections out of cortex, there seems to be some sort of, a common organizational or computational principle. So that's always intrigued, I think, a lot of neuroscientists as well as, theoretical computational folks for a long time. So that's an interesting puzzle to think about. So here's just a depiction of the 6-layered architecture, if you want to call it that, of any slab of the cortex that you take. And many times, even for a very experienced anatomist or neuroscientist, it may be hard to tell, okay, which part of the cortex does this come from? Did it come from visual area 1 or V2, or did it come from A1 or V1, right? It may be hard to just look at the anatomy just to say where it's from. And then there's also some evidence of flexibility. So people like Mriganka Sur have shown that if you divert the inputs from, for example, the visual, visual systems, so for example, from the retina to the auditory cortex, then the auditory cortex starts to develop some properties that look sort of like, visual properties. And the animal may even be able to do some rudimentary visual tasks when the input from the visual system goes to the auditory cortex. And so it's like the auditory cortex is taken over, or at least it's replicating some functions of the visual cortex. And that's another interesting tidbit to think about in terms of, okay, is there a common organizational principle or computational principle going on? And so there's a lot of very reputed neuroscientists going back to Mountcastle, with the columns idea, suggesting, hey, maybe there's something there for us to look at. There's also evolutionarily, it seems like evolution has built the cortex in terms of having cortical areas being added on to existing cortical areas, and there seems to be sophistication that's been added on in terms of the behaviors that animals have been able to do during the course of evolution, right? So perhaps there's something there in terms of, okay, use like a building block that you can keep adding through evolution to have more and more sophisticated behaviors, including language, which is what I'm using, you're listening, and so on. So that's an interesting connection there. So the traditional model that you see in a lot of psychology or even neuroscience textbooks is this one, right? Which is, okay, there's perception, there's cognition, there's action, right? And which is what I learned, and you all learned, which is, there's this nice, interesting kind of feed forward, if you want to call it that, a feed forward model of behavior, right? And then, of course, you can start to map it to different parts of the cortex and say, okay, there's visual perception happens, and then there's a visual decision that happens in the front of the brain, and then there's the motor system in terms of the motor cortex in the middle that then sends commands to the muscles, and the muscles start moving. If you look at the actual anatomy, you'll see something like this, right? Which is there's for every feed forward connection, there's also a reciprocal feedback connection, right? So it's not a purely feed forward system where you go from the back of the head for visual inputs, and then you keep going to the front, and then you go to so it's not a simple feed forward system. So feed forward is blue here, and feedback is red here, right? So that's an anatomical kind of evidence that, okay, there's something more than just a bucket brigade kind of computation going on. So if you think about traditional AI as well, like deep learning models, right? In AI, they were traditionally thought of as, okay, there's this feed forward layer by layer, accumulation of visual features, and then the traditional deep learning architectures have like a decision at the end, right? Is this a cat or a dog, or is this a person A or person B? That is again built on this older model of only a feed forward stage by stage processing all the way till behavior or decision, right? So it doesn't take into account this kind of reciprocal feedback architecture. So back in when I was a grad student, a long time ago, we suggested this predictive coding model. So we were inspired by the work of others, people like David Mumford, and even before that, Don Mackay, and a whole bunch of others. Even going back to the old cybernetics era, where they were thinking of the brain as a control system, right? This idea that if you have this reciprocal connectivity where you have feed forward feedback, it's a very good architecture to implement something like a prediction and error correction kind of mechanism, right? So if you assume that the feedback connections can somehow, in this case, convey predictions or expectations of what is going to come as an input, then the feed forward connections can then compute the error or carry the error signal. And the error signal can be used to correct the estimate. So this box over here represents a recurrent neural network that can generate, in this downward pathway, the reciprocal like prediction, the feedback. And then the error signal, which is coming at the top here, is like the feed forward correction signal, saying that, okay, look, the something that you predicted did not match what I actually saw, so it's a mismatch signal. And the usefulness of that lies in the fact that you can use that error signal to correct whatever you did here, whatever your estimate of the world is, and then that can generate a better prediction. So the goal is to always predict better predictions. The other nice thing this architecture allows you to do is you can do learning. So you can do online correction, error correction, which is the control loop. But you can also use the same error to then change the connections in your neurons, the connections between neurons. And that goes back to the old error-driven learning, like in back propagation, for example, is a standard error-driven learning system that is the basis for all the advances in AI nowadays, right, in terms of deep learning architectures. So this will allow you to do both. You could do real-time, quick updates or adaptation of your circuit, but you can also do a slower adaptation of your synapses, your connections between neurons, yeah? And so that was the basic idea. And if you think about it, what is it really doing? It's actually implementing a form of Bayesian inference. So what is this Bayesian inference or Bayesian model? How many of you have heard of Bayes? Yeah, some of you have heard of Bayes? Okay, yeah, great. So you probably learned about this in your probability theory class, right? Probability and statistics class. So Reverend Thomas Bayes was he was called a nonconformist minister, right? Back in the 1700s. I think we have different interpretation of nonconformists nowadays. But in those days, they had the capacity to also think about philosophy and mathematics, and in his case, statistics and probability theory, right? Reverend Bayes, right, had this publication first, right? This was the, it's called Divine Benevolence, or an attempt to prove that the principal end of the divine providence and government is the happiness of his creatures, right? So any idea what this is about? It's not Bayes' theorem, so it's not the theorem, or and unfortunately for Bayes, it's not very well cited, right? It's not. If you look at Google Scholar, you won't find too many citations on this paper of his. So basically, this was an attempt by Bayes to show that God is actually beneficial to humans, right? Is a kind creature, a kind being. So he's actually trying to help. Because this was in response to another, I think, person who had published a paper saying, no, there's like, it's not really established that God is actually kind or is there to help humans. And this was his attempt to prove that no, that is really not true, right? But he's much more well known for this paper. So this is the one that actually did propose what has come to be known as Bayes' theorem or Bayes' rule. And this is an essay towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chances, which is in probability theory. And this was communicated by his friend actually after he had died. So this is actually a posthumous publication by this Mr. Price, right, who was actually somebody who had looked through his writings and decided to publish this after he was not there. And this is the one that actually did have the Bayes theorem that we all know and love today, right? And one last thing before we leave, Reverend Bayes says, we don't really know if that's this picture. So there's uncertainty even in this picture. So there's some slight probability that may not even be him, and just some random, a minister from the 1700s. So we don't know. So here's just a really quick overview of this Bayes, and you'll see how this relates to predictive coding as well. So basically, the idea with Bayes, any kind of Bayesian inference or Bayes theorem is the idea, which I think is very intuitive, right? Which is, when you enter a situation, you always come with some prior expectation or belief. So you entered this conference room. For me, it was the first time, so I knew a conference room was going to have a bunch of chairs and tables, and it's going to have a projector, it's going to have like a podium. So that's something that I came in with, right? And if it turned out that this was actually, turned out to be a kitchen, right? Then I would know immediately, okay, yeah, it's like mismatching my prior belief, right? And so there's always this notion of, okay, some prior belief that you come with. So P of X is like the probability that X, is, correct, which is X is some hypotheses. Like, okay, this is going to be a conference room, right? And then when you enter the situation, or when you have the sensory input, there's some sensory inputs coming in from the eyes and the ears and so on. What you do then is you have this idea of how do you combine the sensory evidence with the prior belief you have. And so Bayes' theorem is one way of doing that. And it's a mathematically rigorous way of doing that, which includes uncertainty estimates also, right? So if you look at the equation, all it says is, okay, you have some belief, which was this belief, the P of X. And then you multiply it with the new information, the probability for that new information to be correct or to support that hypothesis. The P of I conditioned on X is the fact that if I believe in this hypothesis, this is a conference room, then is the image I'm seeing now, let's say, of all these chairs and tables, what is the probability of that happening, right? And it'll be a pretty high probability because most conference rooms are going to have tables and chairs and so on, right? And it's going to confirm my belief if this is actually a big number, right? And the denominator is just a scaling factor to make sure the probability sums to 1, right? So the main thing is this product over here. So you're multiplying your prior belief with your likelihood or the evidence that's coming in. And then what you get as a result is this revised belief, or it's like a posterior probability, right, in mathematics. And that's just saying, here's the probability of my hypothesis X given the new evidence that came in, the I, right? The I is the new information came in. So think of it as just another way, think of it as a mathematically rigorous way to update your beliefs every time you see some new evidence, right? And that's all it is. And of course, all the different algorithms and so on for Bayes and inference have to do with how is this implemented, right? How do you implement this? How do you do it over time? So if I have many measurements I make, so I1, I2, I3, so I is basically a single sample. But if I get many samples, how do I keep updating my belief over time, right? How do I do it for visual images? How do I do it for auditory? So you can come up with different assumptions. Is it a Bayesian? Is it a multimodal, probability distributions? There's a lot of different assumptions you can make about how this is implemented in the brain or otherwise, right? Okay, so this is another motivating example, which is, anybody know who this is? Is the person depicted? If you know, I guess don't say that out loud, right? But you have a finely tuned sense of this person's hands. It looks like, but then this should be a kind of easier clue, right? So this should be a strong clue. And then as you reveal more evidence, right? So your brain is building up a posterior probability of who this person is, and pretty easily you're going to like converge to who that is, right? So essentially, this is where I'm giving you the samples, right, of different pieces. In reality, you would have done this by moving your eyes, right? You would have moved your eyes, so that's the active vision or active sampling of the environment. So animals do that all the time, right? So active sampling is pretty much how we perceive the world, in a natural setting. So this Bayesian brain hypothesis suggests that in this case, we were saying for the neocortex, right? You can also say the brain in general. But in this case, say the neocortex learns a model of the world, right? It learns an internal model of the world. And the advantage of this model is it allows you to generate predictions or expectations of any scenario. And that allows you to, in turn, estimate the state of the world, right? Or the most likely causes, like the hidden causes of the sensations that you're feeling or sensing right now. So that's kind of the general idea of this Bayesian brain hypotheses. And of course, the implementations are going to differ, right? And this picture is, don't take it literally that you have a model of some mountains. And basically what this is saying is that there's some notion of a internal model, right, that you have in your brain, and then that is being used for this idea of planning, for imagination, for making predictions and estimating the state of the world. And then the predictive coding model was specifically suggested at that time in the late 1990s for the visual cortex. So the visual cortex, as we know, has this approximately hierarchical structure, where the higher areas, such as visual area 2, 4, and infratemporal cortex, there seems to be an increase in the spatial receptive field or complexity of the kinds of things the neurons are encoding. And so the idea was, we can build a hierarchy of these feed-forward feedback type circuits, and each area, like V2, for example, would be getting inputs from V1, but then it would be learning things at a higher order or higher spatial and temporal scale, right? And by the time you get to a higher area like infratemporal cortex, you may be at the stage where you can start to process, faces or objects and things like that. Whereas the lower areas like V1, primary visual cortex, you're only looking at little bars and edges and moving bars and edges and so on. So you're sort of building up this hierarchy. But the key thing here was it was not a feed-forward system. It's actually a feedback system. So every area is saying, okay, hey, I think this is a conference room. So then it's going to send some contextual information back to the lower areas. And the lower areas would then say, hey, yeah, you're right. This is a conference room because the prediction error is actually matching quite well what I see, right? So the error signal would be low. It may not be perfectly zero, but it'll be pretty low because you're matching your expectation, as opposed to if suddenly somebody got up there and started dancing, then my prediction error would be pretty high, right, in that case. But then maybe eventually I'll say, okay, that person just loves to dance when they're watching some talk, right? So so basically you have this kind of an architecture, right? And you have increasingly abstract representations from the lower to the higher areas. And just to give you this kind of interesting social science fact, right? If you look at the Google Scholar, citations for that particular paper back in 1999, you'll notice that there seems to be a growing interest in this general idea, right? You can call this predictive processing or predictive coding. And interestingly, if you look at the first 10 years, nothing going on. It's like crickets, right? So not much interest or citation. So the moral of the story is, especially if you're grad students, postdocs, junior faculty, don't lose hope, right? You may not get cited until the time is right for certain ideas, because perhaps the field is still coming up with tools to test these kinds of hypotheses and trying to falsify the theory or validate the theory and so on. And there's a bunch of papers, especially Carl Friston has been really vocal in terms of trying to push some of these ideas forward and applying it to a whole bunch of other areas in the form of the free energy principle, right? That's his main take on these kinds of ideas. And there's some books as well that have been published in the recent decade or so. So this is where I'll start to deviate from that old idea. So in some sense, I would say the traditional model was very naive, right? In terms of just focusing on visual perception in the form of a hierarchy of a static image. But even if you give a static image, like this is a picture of a bee, right? We can all see that. if you look at what really is happening in terms of what the visual cortex is getting, right? It's not getting this big snapshot of the whole image. What it's getting is, good, fine resolution, high resolution images that are from the fovea, right, of the eye movements, from the eye movements that the person or the animal is making, right? So on the left-hand side here, you can see the actual, part of the scene that is getting, focused on through saccadic eye movements. And if you just look at that, it's kind of hard to make sense of, okay, what exactly is that? Suppose I had not given you this picture and just shown you what's on the left side, right? It's a little bit hard to like piece together the whole big scene, right? Because it depends on how you sample the scene and so on, right? But then for us, it feels like this whole world is stable, right? So right now you're making a lot of head movements, eye movements, and so on, but you don't perceive that as the whole world jerking around, right? You feel like, okay, it's a stable world, right? How is that happening, right? So how is it that we're able to do that? That's a really interesting question. But the bottom line is there are movements that happen in natural perception, right? So it's not a static flash of an image. It's a world that you're sampling constantly, and so the brain gets the sampled information. And this has been observed, going back to Yarbus, Russian, scientist back in the 1960s. He showed that not only do we use eye movements to scan a scene, but the way that you scan the scene depends on the task that you have. There's not like a universal scanning pattern for you and me and others. It's all going to be very dependent on what the task is. So here's an example where the same image, the same scene, depending on what the instruction is. So if you say, okay, there's no instruction, just explore freely, you get this kind of scan path. So these are all eye movements to different fixation points. You can see that if they ask the question, how wealthy are these people? Then you start to scan the clothes of the person, maybe what's on the walls and things like that. Or if you ask, okay, estimate the ages of the person, then there's a lot more focus on the faces of the people to estimate the age of these people, right? And so really it's a task-driven kind of sampling of the scene. So you're using your motor movements, in this case eye movements, to sample the scene. And so the bottom line is that in this case, and in most cases, perception is not static. It involves movements like eye movements, head movements, body movements, and so on. And that's, I think, one of the big messages. At least for me, it was, I'd done some PhD. My PhD work was on active vision, and we were using cameras that can move, just like eye movements and so on. But I had not really connected that to like the predictive coding stuff. And I think that that's an interesting, for me at least, as a grad student to becoming faculty, and after many years going back to that kind of, okay, yeah, let's connect it back to active vision, right? So it was a journey, right? And then it actually is more fundamental than that, I think, right? So I think in terms of just intelligence in general, so what do we mean by intelligence, be it artificial or natural, right? So we all have our notions of intelligence, right? But if you think about it, how did intelligence evolve, right? At least in the biological world, it actually evolved to control the body, right? And why would you want to control the body, right? So, and this is something that Paul Chisek has talked about a lot, which is if you have a single cellular, creature, right, and it has to basically control what's inside the cell membrane, right? So there's these chemical processes that can control the metabolism, right, of the cell and so on. But if there's some nutrients, right, that are not available within the cell body, then you may have to get that externally. So there may be some nutrient on the outside. So the only way to get that, if it's distributed unevenly, is to make some movement and then grab that nutrient. So if you're in need of more nutrients of a particular kind, you have to move, right, to get there. And that's the very beginning of what one might call intelligence, right, in the sense that, okay, move towards something that is good and move away from something that is bad, right? And that sort of, you can build on that notion of control, right, and intelligence, and then you can sort of see how it comes all the way up to, some of the things that we do, which is we don't move right away. We do planning, for example, right, using our brains, and then we make the action afterwards, right? But still, is this notion of, pretty much a lot of things that we do have to do with controlling, what we say, what we do, and so on, what we speak, right? It's all about, actions in that sense, right? Even, I would say even language. And here's where I think there's an interesting difference with large language models. So large language models are essentially predictive systems because they predict the next token, right? So ChatGPT just pretty much learned everything just by trying to predict what's the next word, right? And that is basically like an internal model, right, of the internet in some sense, right? So the ChatGPT is an internal model of the internet, but there's no notion of, at least the pure model did not have a notion of control until they added a reinforcement learning component to it, right, to sort of filter out some of the outputs of ChatGPT. But there's still this notion of, where's the agency coming from for these large language models? And there's no body to control there, right? What these models are controlling in AI is you, right? So you are the body essentially, right? Because you're doing things in response to what these AIs are giving you as an output, right? And then you can feed back a next prompt and a next prompt and so on. And that's how you're closing the loop with the world with these AI systems, right? But you can imagine extending that to having a robot, for example, interacting with these large language models, and then you get into something more biologically, similar to what biology does, right? So anyway, so that's and there's other people like Buzaki's written a book, The Brain Inside Out, and then there's others like Powers and Friston who also been looking into this notion of, okay, actions seem to be quite central in these definitions of intelligence to understand the brain. Why don't we center actions as a way to understand, right, why the brain does the kind of things that it does, because it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view and also from a control point of view. All right, and then I'll briefly mention a couple of results from neuroscience as well, more recent results that seem to be indicating that actions seem to be important. So this was an interesting wide field calcium imaging experiment in mice that was done by Zutka et al. In the laboratory of Carandini and Harris. And what they showed was that in this case, the animal is trying to make a decision, a visual decision shown on the left-hand side between one grading versus another grading, and they were trying to record from these many areas of the brain using this wide field imaging. And what they found was that even before the actual action takes place, so the animal has to indicate its choice through an action, you actually see this activation of the cortex, widespread activation across many different areas. It's not just the motor cortex, but even sensory areas are getting activated, saying, hey, look, I'm going to perform an action, so be ready for it, right? Or be ready for the consequences, sensory consequences of the action to come through. And you can also predict the actual accuracy of the actions that are going to be happening, right? 25 milliseconds even before the actual action, the left versus right choice action takes place. So these are all like really interesting results in terms of, okay, traditionally we thought, that sensory was only doing sensory and motor was doing motor, but there seems to be a lot of interaction between sensory and motor going on here, right? And then the other interesting clue is from anatomy. So if you look at the 6-layered architecture of the cortex I talked about, what you'll find there is that traditionally the sensory inputs from, let's say, the retina and the thalamus would go to these deeper and superficial areas. But then if you look at what actually is happening in terms of the deeper layers of the cortex, like layer 5, for example, there seem to be motor outputs that are going to areas that do control parts of the body, right? Like layer 5 cells. And so for me, this was a revelation where, even what we traditionally thought were primary sensory areas, like primary visual cortex V1, right? Primary auditory cortex A1, and primary somatosensory cortex, S1, they all send outputs to subcortical or below cortex motor centers like the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, the basal ganglia, even the spinal cord, right? Somatosensory cortex to spinal cord. So these are like actual connections to motor structures. And if they're strictly sensory and you believed in that feed-forward model of sensation, cognition, action, this shouldn't really be there, right? So there's another clue that there is a lot of intertwined processing going on between sensory and motor interactions. So the question is why, right? And so in our lab, we've been doing a lot of work in terms of trying to understand it from the perspective of reinforcement learning or AI models in general. And so this is kind of the picture you'll find in textbooks on reinforcement learning, which is that you have any agent, right, which is this box in the bottom. And this is the world that the agent is interacting with. What you'll find is this closed loop between sensation and then motor action. So the motor action changes the world. You get this sampling of the sensory world and so on. But the two components that you'll find in many of these reinforcement learning agents is there's something like a transition function or a dynamics function that is the model of the world. It's predicting what's going to happen next, given that you take some particular action. So it's like a prediction, motor-based prediction of the sensation you're going to have. And the second one is called the policy function, right? And the policy function is your action function. So given that I'm in a particular state of the world, or this is all the sensations that I've seen so far, and here's the state of the world summarized in some state, then I'm going to make this, I'm going to choose this action, right? And so reinforcement learning algorithms like temporal difference learning or Q learning, all these algorithms, they focus on learning this policy function using a neural network. And the model-based ones, they also learn a model of the world, which is given by this dynamics or state transition function. Okay, so those are the two main components of these kinds of structures. Yeah. So what we did was trying to understand, okay, can we fit something like this architecture into this laminar 6-layered architecture of the cortex? And that's how we came up with, the first guess that, okay, perhaps we can map some of those anatomical connections where we have the inputs coming in into the, layer 4 or 5 from the sensory or lower order areas. And then you also have these outputs from this cortical area or this layer 5 to these motor centers, right? But there's also this, you'll notice there's this recurrence going on between the superficial layers or layer 2, 3, going back down to layer 5 and then layer 6 and going back to the thalamus. So there's this loop, and then from the deeper back to the superficial, right? So there's this loop that's also going on within each cortical area. So the idea was, can we start to fit these kinds of architectures into this state transition policy function? So this is what we came up with as a first approximation, right? Which is, if you assume that the sensory information is being used to maintain a state estimate, that is the traditional Bayesian, predictive coding style model. So you have all the sensory inputs coming in, you iteratively, figure out, okay, what's going on in the world, right? But then we're also tagging on this additional function here called the policy function, which is basically figuring out, given that I'm in this state of the world, what is the output that I should send to a motor center, right? It could be to move your eyes, depending on the area of the cortex, right? So if you're in the area that is, controlling a particular part of the body relevant to your sensory modality, you would send your outputs to that particular area, right? And there has to be some system that mediates, all these competing actions. Okay, which one do I choose? And that's, I won't get into that, but that's where you get into the whole notion of, what is the decision-making system? Is it a single system in the subcortical level, or some people may even think, okay, that's where you have secrets to consciousness and things like that, right? But what this is suggesting is that each cortical area has the capacity to send a potential action to particular motor structures, and then there is this sort of competition going on. Could be through the basal ganglia, or it could be in the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, where you make a commitment to a particular action that's chosen, right? And then you'll also notice there's this backward connection going up here, right? So basically, if there is this action that is predicted, right, that, okay, you should take this action given that I'm in this state of the world, then you go up here and you can make use of that efference copy. So some people call that efference copy or corollary discharge, right? It allows you to predict what's going to happen next. So if I'm going to move my hand and touch the table, I can predict how it's going to feel, right? Because it's a wooden table, I've learned that connection between my action and my perception, right? So it's a motor to perception kind of action, translation there. And so this is basically, you can think of it as a module. So if you think of evolutionarily, cortex came up with a way to interact with the other structures in the brain. A sensory motor module like this would be useful because you can learn both the dynamics of what the world is going to behave according to your particular modality or your scale of operation for that particular cortical area. But you can also think of it as there's this policy function also that's allowed to choose actions for you. And of course, this one, the policy function is going to change according to your task, right? So depending on the task, you have to swap this policy function dynamically to change it to a different policy function depending on what the task is, right? Whereas the state transition function captures the physics of the world or the dynamics of the world, right? And that could be independent of the task, and you could learn it, across many different tasks, right?
Question.
Yeah.
Why is it going out?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I forgot to mention. So how do you train this kind of a network? So you need a way to train this network, and you can do that in a couple of different ways. So first of all, for the state network, you can train it the way we would train, any kind of predictive coding style network, which is you take an action, you get a sensory consequence, you made a prediction, oh, the prediction was not good, so what is the error, right? So you can do error-driven learning. So this D is basically a decoder. You can call it a decoder network, but think of it as going from the cortex to the thalamus, for example. And it's basically saying, okay, if this particular sensation happens, right? You can translate your state. You have to translate that back to the lower levels representation, which could be abstract to less abstract, right? So one way to think about it is like this could be, for example, the going from V1 to the thalamus representation. Then the error signal would have to come back up through the feed forward pathway. I've not drawn it here, but think of this as the error signal coming in to update the representation up here, right? So you want to both learn the state transition function or dynamics function, as well as update what the state estimate is, right? In fact, the next picture I think shows that in some sense. So these hats are all the estimated state, estimated action, and then these F hats are the learned transition functions and learned policy functions. So think of these as recurrent neural networks that are being trained to make predictions of what's going to happen next based on the actions that you took. And think of this as a learned policy function or recurrent neural network that's connections are being changed to predict what the action should be given the current state estimate, right? So S hat is like an estimate of the state. And I've drawn these arrows to suggest that this kind of a laminar architecture with 6 layers may be able to implement something like this, right? This kind of a sensory and motor loop, right? And you can use this loop to do things like plan ahead in time or predict ahead in time. But you also need to make sure you correct your actions according to what the real action was that the animal took, right? So there's an A hat over here saying, even if one area said, I want to do this action, the actual action may have been different. So you need to update that as well, right? But anyway, that's, yeah, Chris.
So you just said something about being able to use this for planning ahead in the
Yeah.
future, but this looks like an instantaneous feedback loop to me. So how do you integrate over, if you have persistent errors over time,
Yeah.
you might need to update a model, or where does the integration come in that you would need for forward-looking planning?
Yeah, so there's two different things, right? So one is, when you're actually engaging with the world, that's when you have sensory inputs coming in, and you want to use those sensory inputs to correct your estimates of what the state of the world is. And that's basically, these S hats over here are basically the state estimates. So you would do that similar to like a hidden Markov model or a Kalman filter, right? You would use the prediction errors to constantly be updating your state estimate. And this FS over here, the state transition function, is like the forward model of a Kalman filter, which is a linear model in the Kalman filter case, but you can think of a nonlinear analog to that. And so that would be the temporal integration, right? So every time and that would be done through the prediction errors, right? Saying, okay, I estimated the state of the world to be this, but then when I made a prediction based on that state estimate, it turned out to be this other sensory input. So I'm going to use that error signal to correct my estimate. So that would be happening through the external world, going back up and updating this. And that in turn modulates what the next action should be, right? And that's this lower part. But planning is different in the sense that during planning, you don't incorporate your sensory inputs, right? You're doing it it's like an offline mode, right? And what I was suggesting was that if you want to do planning, you would essentially use these two, parts of the circuit, but not really require any inputs from the sensory system, right? So you'd basically be cycling through this to go forward in time. So you'd say, okay, start off with some particular state. So I'm going to imagine that I'm in my house and, suppose I want to go to work, right? Then I would say, okay, what's the best way to go to work, right? So I could do like a forward projection of saying, okay, this action would be, okay, I'm going to take the bus, right? So at the highest level, it would be like taking the bus. It's an abstract action. But then, as we'll see, if you have a hierarchical system, then you can say, okay, at some point, you get to the point where you have to open the door of the house, maybe walk, you have to walk to the bus stop and so on. And as you're doing that, you can predict what the consequence of that to be. And now if I start walking towards the bus stop, right? Suppose I imagine walking to the bus stop, right? Then I can say, okay, what am I going to see there? I can imagine that as well, right? Depending on if I've learned the dynamics of that system, right? And so planning could be done in terms of exploring possible futures, which could be done if these are learned properly, right? Or learned from the environment interactions. And then you can choose the most desirable trajectory, right? You could say, okay, 10 steps into the future, I'm going to get a big reward because, maybe I'm hungry, I want to go to the restaurant, right? So you can sort of predict which trajectory is best. For some of you, it may be, okay, I'm going to go through this trajectory in my career because if I get a PhD in neuroscience, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to be very happy, right? So that's like a long-term planning, right? Which again could be, actions are abstract, the predictions are going to be at a very high level, right? Over a very long time scale, right? But that's the way I think about planning is, that kind of projection into the future. It assumes that you have a good model of the world and you have a good model of the, these policies, right? What actions to take as well. All right, so here's just, I was talking about this notion of abstraction. So you can basically make this hierarchical by assuming, okay, any kind of complicated action that you want to take, like going to the grocery store, has to have this kind of decomposition into lower level subroutines or behaviors. Like going to the grocery store would involve if you want to go in the car, you have all these steps you have to take, and then each of those has its own set of lower level routines. So if you have a hierarchical system, it is able to really nicely partition the task into a bunch of policies and transition functions at different abstraction levels, and that in turn allows you to solve a bunch of tasks by composing, right, complicated solutions by making use of simpler policies and simpler, transition functions. And that's the whole idea is, Cortex may have evolved a way to really tackle the complexity of the world by dividing very, very complicated dynamics into smaller pieces that can be then composed to model, very complicated dynamics and very complicated actions as well, action sequences. So I'll leave you with, so I'm gonna probably end in about 5 minutes here. So here's the hierarchical implementation of it. So basically, if you have the same module, right, that we had before of the sensory, the state transition and the action functions connected to each other, this is that loop that we talked about, then if you have a higher area that is also doing the same thing, but operating at a higher level of abstraction, it can modulate these functions directly, right, through these, in AI, they call them hyper networks, but you can think of it as essentially neural networks that change the dynamics of these recurrent neural networks at the lower level, right? And if you can do that, then you're, all is good, because now you can really change the dynamics at the lower level as well as the actions being computed at the lower level according to higher level goals that you may have, right? So this could be a higher level goal. This is the higher level context, right? Okay, I'm in this room. It's going to have particular dynamics and particular things in the room and so on, right? So the bottom line is, you could modulate lower level. So if you think of cortical feedback connections as modulatory, right? They're modulating the dynamics of lower level recurrent neural networks. Then you can do something like this, right? Where the higher level does planning or does state estimation or action selection at a higher level of abstraction. Lower areas are going to be doing the same kind of phenomenon, but at a lower level of abstraction, like faster time scales, smaller spatial scale, and things like that. And we can do that to manage complexity of the world. All right, so yeah, so a couple of different groups have actually shown that you can actually do something like this. So for example, this notion of higher level states or actions modulating the dynamics of the lower level states or actions. There was a paper in Nature Neuroscience showing that you can essentially use this kind of a top-down modulation by having a contextual input to a recurrent neural network that allows the same recurrent neural network to solve many different tasks, right? A bunch of tasks can be solved by the same neural network as long as you have a contextual input top-down coming in from a higher input to a particular recurrent neural network. And they were doing it in the context of multitask learning with recurrent neural networks. Another way you could do that is, you could also have gain modulation. So people have shown that if you are able to change the gain of the input-output function, so here's an input-output function of a neuron, change the gain of the input-output function of a neuron, you can have different dynamics in the recurrent neural network. So they were doing this to simulate motor cortex dynamics, right? And they showed that, again, gain modulation is a way to change the function being computed at a lower level recurrent neural network. So I'm just showing these as examples of what you could do, right, in terms of biologically plausible ways of changing the dynamics of lower level neural networks. And then just to give you an idea that there's evidence already for these kinds of predictive state networks. You may have heard of the visual cortex and parietal cortex. Before you make an eye movement, there seems to be some anticipatory activity in these areas, in many different areas in the cortex, actually. And that seems to be consistent with this idea of an efference copy of your motor command going and setting up the visual cortex to then anticipate some incoming neural activity. There's also some really cool results from Audit et al. In Snyder's lab showing that if you train an animal like a rodent to press a lever and then there's a sound that happens, then the motor cortex sends this efference copy to the auditory cortex to then anticipate or predict the sound that's going to come in. And this is an artificial situation, but the animal learns to predict the sound based on the motor action, right? So there's this kind of sensory prediction going on there from one area to another area in that case. Similarly for action networks, you've all seen this Churchland et al.'s cool results of dynamical systems in the motor cortex, which is again a recurrent neural network, right? You can think of it as a dynamical system that has recurrent activity and some control inputs that are coming in. And that's similar to, in our case, we have this action or policy networks that are, predicting what the next action should be, but it is a function of the current state, the sensory state of the system. And some recent results from Sorber et al. Showed that if you look at the thalamus and the cortex, you actually see that they're actually dependent on each other, right? So it's actually a sensory and motor combination. So you do need to have the sensory inputs that are feeding into the motor cortex that is then implementing this kind of a action network that has these properties, right? These rotational properties that you see here in this particular, latent space representation. All right, so I should probably wrap up soon, right? So let me leave you with a couple of examples of what we've done with this architecture, right? So one is active vision. So what we've shown is that you can use this kind of architecture to solve visual perception tasks. So we've trained these networks to minimize the prediction error of where you move your eyes. In this case, a region of the camera is being moved to different locations, in this case, these digits. And we've trained the action networks to minimize the task loss, which in this case could be classification accuracy, or it could be reconstruction of the scene. So you have to sample the scene properly to reconstruct the scene. And this is the kind of learned policies that you get, right? So you can see how when the network samples different regions of the scene, it's doing it at multiple spatial scales. So there's a more abstract, bigger location that you're fixating on, and then within that big region, you sample some smaller regions, right? And then on the left side, you can see the reconstruction or its belief of what's out there, right? So as it gets more evidence, it gets a better and better picture of what's happening. And the cool thing is, if you look at this, even though this is jittering around a lot, it's basically sampling the scene by moving the eyes a lot. This is a very stable representation of the world, right? So the world is stable for the network, even though the eyes are moving around and sampling different parts of the scene. And that's because it is able to predict what's going to happen next. It has learned to predict that, okay, if I go from here to here, there's going to be this expectation of what I'm going to see, right? If I believe it's an 8 or a 7 or a 5 and so on, it gradually builds up, this recurrent neural network builds up a representation of the world in this case. And you can learn part whole hierarchy. So this is what it learns at different scales. And not only does it learn the parts, it also learns the location of the parts because it knows where to look within a reference frame. It learns, but this part goes here, this part goes here. And there's a nice way to compose new scenes as well. You can compose a new scene using these parts, right? And the final example I'll give is this one, which is, the claim was that the same architecture can do many, many different things, right? If the claim is that the cortex is actually a very versatile computational system. And so we can actually solve tasks like navigation, for example, again, in this hierarchical way. So if the goal is to get from this blue dot to this green square over here, right? If the system has already learned to navigate smaller, rooms, like these are like smaller segments that compose this very complicated environment, then you can do that, right? You can basically learn to solve these more simpler tasks, and you can compose. So here's just some policies you've learned to go to all these locations within the small regions, right? But this is a wall, right, that you can learn to navigate around. Then what you can show is that to get to this green location here, you can plan at the higher level and predict what's going to which room segment you're going to go next, and eventually get to that room that you want to get to, and then you can navigate to that particular location. So you can do planning at a very high level, which reduces the complexity. So I'll just skip this and just show you the results. So you can basically, in order to get from here to here, you can plan at the higher level of this room to that room to that room, and then you can then execute that lower level policy you learned and get to this location from this location. So you don't have to plan at the muscle level, right? Essentially, you're not planning at how to move your legs. You're planning at the level of, okay, goal number 1, goal number 2, goal number 3, or abstract action number 1, 2, and 3, okay? And there's some results that we have here and so on. Let me wrap up by, I'll just wrap up to the last slide here. So I had some stuff on memory and let me just do this one here just to give you an idea that, because the title of the talk was actions, right? So why are actions important? So you may ask, okay, are actions important in higher level cognition as well? And so this particular example, I really like. This is actually an example borrowed from the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine paper of Whittington et al. And if you want to learn an abstract concept like a family tree, right? What does that mean? So you can actually think of in an abstract structure like this, right? Sorry, again, you can use a recurrent neural network to learn to navigate, in this case, this very abstract structure where the actions are all about navigating the nodes of the tree, right? So you can say, okay, I'm currently, if I'm thinking of somebody who may be, a daughter here, right? Then I can have an action that goes to, okay, who's the uncle of this person? And you can go to that part of the node, right? Or you can say, who's the parent, right? Who's the mother, who's the father, and so on. And by being exposed to many examples, you can learn this abstract structure of a family tree where, again, it's all about actions within this very abstract space, and the sensations are all about this internal representation, right, that you're getting. So you can even train a neural network, which is what they did. You can train a neural network to learn these kinds of abstract graphical structures, right? And if you think about other things like mathematics, right? So mathematics, how is that action related, right? So if you think about arithmetic or multiplication, addition, right? So you can think of it, okay, I'm applying the action of addition to abstract entities, which are, numbers, right? Language, even language is similar, right? In the sense that, okay, there's verbs that you apply, which are actions to some nouns, and there's adjectives, right? So you can think of even there you're choosing, you have a goal, which is to convey your thought to somebody else. And the goal gets distilled into lower level actions, which are the words, right, that you're saying. And eventually, of course, if you're writing or typing or speaking, it's muscles, right, that control you. But again, it's all about actions in that case as well, right? So hopefully, yeah, I mean, what I've done is given you just a, hopefully inspired some of you to think about, okay, this idea of the cortex as maintaining some kind of a generative internal model of the world. And perhaps we need to think about the sensory and motor processes as being intertwined quite closely as opposed to being very separate from each other. And then this particular model, this active predictive coding model, right, it suggests that the same cortical algorithm perhaps can be used to solve multiple tasks. And of course, that's a challenge. We haven't shown that yet, but perhaps it's a way to think about perception action in general, right, in terms of what it can do. There's a lot to be done, right? And especially working out the interactions between neocortex and subcortical structures, which are evolutionarily there, they've been there for a long time. And so cortex does not operate on its own. It has to interact with the thalamus, basal ganglia, cerebellum, brainstem, and all the other structures there. So I think that's really important for us. Even I've been very cortex-centric, but I'm guilty of that, cortex chauvinist. So I'm trying to think of how these structures interact, and that's really important for us as a field, I think. And so a lot of work to be done, and your help is needed, right? So I think we need more, brilliant people, youngsters in the room to think about, okay, how the data is coming through at a rapid pace, but I think, yeah, you need to use your intuitions and your training to think about, okay, how does it all fit together? It's like this amazing puzzle, right? Defining who we are as humans in some sense, right? I mean, there's all these diseases we can, help to treat, but also philosophically, it's basically, understanding who we are as humans. And I think that's a really key question for science and humanity in general, right? So, and there's some papers you can take a look at that talks about these particular ideas. And of course, I would be remiss if I don't thank all my students and postdocs. Some of them have already graduated, others are in the process of doing their PhDs. And then finally, some collaborators in the past and current, and also funding, right? And so visit us in Seattle. It's always sunny like this. So.
So it's actually already 12:22. So maybe just one question. And then, yeah.
Very good.
And then I guess the rest of the questions.
You can always email me your questions as well. So feel free to email me afterwards. Yeah.
My question is, like, in regards to, you talked about the policy as being like the thing that's context dependent, but the state, the representation of the state is being somewhat fixed, like. I wouldn't say it's fixed. I would say that the transition function, right? It's a function which captures the physics of the world or the dynamics of the world. It's not fixed in the sense that it can change according to the context of the situation you're in. Like, think of it as, a schema or, right? Yeah. Variable. So yeah, that was my question.
Right. And I think it's important to do that because it reduces the search space also, right? So when I enter this room, I'm going to load the context or schema for this conference room, right? But if I go to a different, like an office, it's going to be a different kind of context, right? So I'm going to load a different schema there, right? So I think that's really an important question. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, sorry, thinking that you might have like handwriting, be the same with different spatial.
Yes. Yes.
So the coordinates are probably very different.
Exactly. That's part of this dynamics, right? This transition function. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.